Picture yourself on a misty morning in the 14th century. The ground trembles under the weight of 1,000 armored riders, the air thick with the sound of clinking chainmail and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of massive war horses. In the center of it all is a knight, his life utterly dependent on the powerful animal beneath him. This horse is more than a mount. It is his closest ally in the chaos of battle, his only means of escape, a living engine of war whose strength and health could mean the difference between glorious victory and a forgotten death in the mud. But have you ever stopped to wonder, in an age before antibiotics, before modern surgery, before we even understood the fundamentals of germ theory, how did they do it? How did medieval societies keep these incredible animals, so crucial not just to warfare, but to the very backbone of agriculture, trade, and daily travel functioning, healthy, and ready for the immense demands placed upon them? This question opens the door to one of history's most fascinating and overlooked puzzles. We are about to journey into the surprisingly sophisticated and often secretive world of medieval horse care, a realm of forgotten knowledge where practical wisdom was passed down in whispers, recorded in obscure manuscripts, and guarded as closely as any military secret. This was not a simple time of brute force and ignorance. It was an era of intricate observation, of remedies born from trial and error over centuries, and of a deep, symbiotic bond between human and animal that we can scarcely comprehend today. The methods they developed are a testament to human ingenuity, a collection of lost arts that kept empires moving and knights in the saddle. We will uncover the herbal poultices applied to battle wounds, the specialized diets formulated for different classes of horses, the intricate training methods that forged an unbreakable bond between rider and steed, and the shadowy figures, the farriers and marshals, who held the well-being of these precious creatures in their hands. This is more than just a history lesson. It is a recovery of a lost connection, a look into a partnership that shaped our world. So join us as we pull back the veil on this incredible chapter of our past, piecing together clues from ancient texts and archaeological finds to reveal how the care of the medieval horse was one of the period's greatest and quietest achievements. To truly grasp the meticulous care these animals received, we first need to understand that a horse in the Middle Ages was far more than a pet or a simple beast of burden. It was, in the most literal sense, a form of liquid capital, a living, breathing investment that could make or break a family, a farm, or a knight's entire career. Think of the war horse, the massive destrier bred for strength and courage in the heat of battle. The cost of such an animal was astronomical. Historical records from the 13th century show that a top-tier destrier could be valued at as much as 80 pounds, while a common knight's annual income might only be around 10 to 20 pounds. This means a single horse could represent 4 or 5 years of a knight's entire earnings. It was the equivalent of a modern soldier purchasing a main battle tank with their own personal savings. Losing a horse in combat wasn't just a tactical setback. It was a financial catastrophe that could instantly bankrupt a nobleman and erase his family's standing. But the economic footprint of the horse extended far beyond the tournament fields and battle lines. In an age without tractors, the agricultural horsepower that plowed the fields and hauled the harvest was the very engine of the medieval economy. A prosperous village might rely on a team of 8 oxen for the heavy plowing, but for faster, more versatile work like carting goods to market or powering mill wheels, horses were indispensable. The difference in efficiency was stark. A horse could plow up to 1.5 acres in a day, significantly more than an ox, and could work for more hours. This agricultural output directly translated into wealth and survival for the entire community. Furthermore, the sprawling network of trade that connected Europe depended entirely on hooves and wheels. Merchants' caravans, the royal postal service, pilgrims traveling to distant shrines, all of this movement was fueled by the endurance of the horse. A well-maintained pack horse or a sturdy palfrey used for riding was a merchant's most valuable asset, enabling him to transport goods across treacherous routes and turn a profit. This reliance created an entire ecosystem of supporting industries: saddlers, lorimers who made metal horse fittings, cartwrights, and of course, the specialized caregivers themselves. The social status conveyed by horse ownership cannot be overstated. The type of horse you rode was a direct and immediate signal of your place in the feudal hierarchy. A noble would never be seen on a common plow horse, just as a wealthy merchant would aspire to own a smooth-gaited palfrey for comfortable travel. This intricate link between the horse and its owner's economic and social survival created an overwhelming, non-negotiable imperative for expert care. You didn't just feed and water a horse, you protected a fortune. You didn't simply treat a lame leg, you were safeguarding your family's future and your very way of life. This profound, tangible value is the foundation upon which the entire, intricate edifice of medieval equine medicine and management was built. Given the immense value of these animals, it's no surprise that their housing was far from an afterthought. The medieval stable was a carefully engineered environment, a fortress of well-being designed to protect its precious occupants from the elements and from illness. In a grand castle, the stable was often a separate, substantial stone building located within the inner bailey for security, sometimes even connected to the knight's quarters or the great hall by a covered passage. Its walls were thick, not just for defense, but for insulation, keeping the interior cool in the summer and retaining the animal's body heat in the winter. Stepping inside, you'd notice the floor immediately. It wasn't simply packed earth, it was a complex, layered system. The base was often a deep layer of gravel for drainage, topped with a thick, absorbent bedding of rye straw or sometimes peat moss, which was prized for its ability to draw moisture away from the horse's hooves and provide a soft, dry place to lie down. This bedding was mucked out and replaced daily, a constant, labor-intensive process that was absolutely vital for health. High above, the roof architecture was critical. Vaulted ceilings or a clever system of louvers and vents allowed warm, moisture-laden air and ammonia, fumes from urine to escape, while preventing harsh drafts from sweeping along the ground where the horses stood. This constant, gentle air exchange was their primary defense against respiratory diseases, which could devastate a stable of valuable animals as quickly as any plague. For the most prized horses, like a lord's personal destrier or his prized palfrey, individual stalls were the standard. These weren't the wooden boxes we imagine today. They were often substantial partitions of thick oak, sometimes with a small hay rack and a manger for oats. This separation prevented fighting, allowed for customized feeding regimens, and, crucially, stopped the rapid spread of contagious diseases like strangles. The horse would be tethered with a rope or leather halter to a sturdy ring in the wall, but given enough slack to lie down comfortably. For the common cart horses, plow horses, or a knight's less valuable rounceys, communal stabling was more common. These animals might be housed together in a large, open bay, tethered to a central pole or simply left loose. While less luxurious, these spaces still adhered to the same core principles of dryness and ventilation. Security was another paramount concern. The stable door was heavy, often reinforced with iron bands, and secured with a substantial lock. In a time when a single stolen warhorse could cripple a knight's ability to answer his lord's call to arms, protecting this asset was as important as protecting the castle treasury. The stable was more than a barn. It was a dedicated, secure hospital, a resting place, and a testament to the fact that medieval people understood a fundamental truth we still recognize today. An animal's environment is the first and most important line of defense in maintaining its health and vitality. Now let's step inside that stable and look down, because the true secret to equine health began not with a medicine bottle, but with what was underfoot. The medieval stable floor was a carefully constructed micro-ecosystem, and the choice of bedding material was a science in itself, balancing comfort, insulation, and critically, hygiene. Straw, typically from rye or wheat, was the gold standard for the well-funded stable. It was relatively absorbent, provided excellent cushioning for a horse to lie down on, and was pliable enough to form a good, deep bed. But in regions where grain straw was scarce or reserved for thatching roofs, stable masters got creative. They might use rushes, harvested from riverbanks, which were soft and plentiful but less absorbent and prone to matting down. In heathland areas, bundles of springy heather were a common substitute, offering a surprisingly resilient and aromatic bedding that helped repel insects. Each material had its trade-offs, and the choice often came down to local availability and the specific needs of the horse. The most fascinating and counterintuitive practice, however, was the deep litter system, a brilliant piece of passive bioengineering employed during the harsh winter months. Instead of mucking out the soiled bedding every single day, the grooms would simply add a fresh, thick layer of new straw on top of the old. Over weeks and months, this created a deep, composting mat. As the layers of manure, urine, and straw decomposed at the bottom, they generated a consistent, low-level heat, effectively turning the entire stable floor into a giant, slow-burning radiator that kept the animals warm from the ground up. This was a monumental advantage in an era without insulated walls or electric heaters, protecting horses from chill and conditions like rheumatism. But this ingenious solution presented a perplexing mystery to modern historians. How did they prevent the inevitable health issues that such a system would seem to cause? We know that constant exposure to ammonia from urine can burn the lungs and lead to respiratory disease, and a perpetually damp, bacteria-rich environment is a breeding ground for hoof ailments like thrush, a painful infection of the frog of the hoof. The medieval marshals clearly knew something we are only now rediscovering. The key was in the meticulous management of the system. They weren't just piling straw on filth, they were managing an active compost heap. The deep litter had to be built up with a sufficient volume of carbon-rich, dry straw to balance the nitrogen in the waste, which absorbed the moisture and neutralized the odors far more effectively than a thin, sodden layer would. The bottom layers were actively composting, a process that generates high temperatures capable of killing many pathogens. Furthermore, the horse's own hooves would constantly mix the bedding, incorporating oxygen which is essential for healthy, aerobic decomposition rather than the foul, anaerobic kind. The grooms also practiced a form of spot cleaning, removing obviously wet patches and solid manure daily while leaving the bulk of the composting base intact. It was a delicate, carefully observed balance, adding just enough new bedding to stay ahead of the moisture, and knowing precisely when the entire mass had to be dug out and replaced, usually in the spring. This practice reveals a profound, almost intuitive understanding of natural cycles that modern science later confirmed. They were harnessing the power of decomposition not just for warmth, but to create a healthier overall environment than a cold, frequently washed stone floor could provide. The mystery of their success wasn't in ignoring hygiene, but in mastering a more complex, symbiotic form of it. Yet for all the sophistication of their stables, even the most perfectly designed environment was useless without the one resource that fueled the entire operation: high-quality fodder. The annual hay harvest was not merely a seasonal chore. It was the single most critical, nail-biting logistical challenge for any medieval estate. A true race against time where success meant survival and failure spelled economic ruin and the slow, gruesome starvation of their most valuable assets. Unlike today, where we can simply purchase bagged feed year-round, the medieval world operated on a strict annual cycle. Everything a horse would eat between the first frosts of October and the first green shoots of late April had to be grown, cut, dried, and stored within a narrow window of just a few weeks in high summer. The pressure was immense, as the hay crop directly determined how many animals you could afford to keep through the winter. A poor harvest meant difficult, heartbreaking decisions, selling off younger stock at a loss or watching prized animals slowly weaken and succumb to malnutrition. The entire manorial economy, from the lord's stables to the peasant's single plow horse, pivoted on this one, all-important yield. The process began not in the field, but with generations of accrued knowledge about the land itself. The best hay came from low-lying meadows that were naturally fertilized by seasonal river floods, depositing a rich layer of silt that produced a thick, nutrient-dense stand of grasses. These water meadows were so valuable they were often specifically named in property disputes and royal land grants. The types of grasses and legumes chosen were selected for their specific benefits. Common meadow grasses like ryegrass and timothy were valued for their robust yield and good nutritional content. But the true secret ingredient was leguminous plants like clover and vetches. While they may not have understood the science of nitrogen fixation, medieval farmers knew from observation that fields containing these plants produced stronger, healthier animals. Clover, in particular, was a superfood. It was richer in protein than grass alone, aiding in muscle development and recovery, which was absolutely vital for a warhorse expected to carry immense weight and armor. The act of haymaking itself was a carefully orchestrated communal effort, a true village-wide endeavor. Using long, curved scythes, teams of men would move in unison to fell the tall grass, leaving it in neat rows called swaths to be dried by the sun. This drying phase was the most delicate part of the entire operation. If the hay was baled too damp, it would ferment and mold in the stack, producing toxins that could cause colic, respiratory failure, and a swift, painful death for any horse that ate it. Yet if it was left out too long and became over-dried, it would lose its precious leaves and nutritional value, becoming little more than worthless straw. The haymakers had to become master readers of the weather, turning the swaths multiple times a day with wooden rakes to ensure even drying, all while anxiously scanning the horizon for the summer thunderstorms that could ruin an entire week's labor in minutes. Once the hay was perfectly cured, judged by its color and the distinctive sweet smell that experienced farmers recognized, the frantic work of storage began. This is where medieval engineering truly shone. The hay couldn't simply be piled in a barn. It had to be stored in a way that preserved its dry state for months on end. For this, they relied on two primary structures, the hayloft and the hayrick. The hayloft was the architectural masterpiece of the stable, a spacious upper floor built directly above the horse stalls. Its floor was often constructed of closely spaced oak planks that allowed any residual moisture and dust to sift down, while its high, vented roof provided continuous air circulation to prevent mustiness. Getting the hay up there was a feat of strength and coordination, using block and tackle systems or simply pitchforks and strong backs. But for larger estates with surplus hay, or for storage in open fields, the construction of the external hayrick was an art form in itself. A poorly built rick would settle, absorb ground moisture, and rot from the inside out. A well-built one, however, could shed rainwater and keep its core perfectly dry until spring. The base was crucial, often raised on a platform of stones or brushwood to create a barrier against damp earth. The rick was then built layer by layer, with the hay stacked in a specific, inward-sloping shape that encouraged water to run off the sides, much like thatching a roof. The very top was often capped with a protective layer of rougher, reed-like material. These ricks weren't just piles, they were vast, expertly crafted organic monuments, their successful preservation a matter of immense pride and profound relief for the entire community. The haymaker's art was, therefore, a high-stakes combination of botany, meteorology, and structural engineering, all dedicated to a single vital purpose: ensuring that when the deep snows fell and the world froze, the life-sustaining heartbeat of the medieval world, the horse, would continue to thrive in its warm stable, nourished by the sweet, summer-cured essence of the sun. But even the most perfect hay could only provide a baseline of sustenance. For the immense physical demands placed upon a medieval horse, especially the elite war horses and fast-paced riding palfreys, a fuel of far greater concentration was required. This is where the humble oats stepped into the spotlight, transforming from a simple grain into a veritable superfuel that powered the medieval world's most demanding engine. Oats were the undisputed champion of equine energy, prized above all other grains like barley or wheat. The reason lies in their unique nutritional profile. Oats are higher in fiber and have a better balance of essential amino acids for muscle building and repair compared to other cereals. More importantly, their energy is released slowly and steadily into the horse's system, providing a long-lasting reservoir of power rather than a sharp, dangerous sugar spike. This was absolutely critical for a knight's destrier, which needed explosive strength for a cavalry charge, but also the steady endurance for hours of maneuvering on a campaign. Think of a modern endurance athlete carefully consuming complex carbohydrates before a marathon. The medieval marshal was applying the same principle, using oats to build a deep, resilient energy reserve in his animal. But this powerful fuel came with a strict social hierarchy. The grain ration a horse received was a direct and unmistakable symbol of its owner's wealth and the animal's own societal role. A common plow horse or a carter's draft animal, performing vital but slow, heavy work, would subsist primarily on hay, perhaps receiving a scant handful of oats only during the most labor-intensive periods like plowing season. Its value, while significant, did not justify the expense of a daily grain ration. In stark contrast, a knight's prized charger lived on a different plane altogether. Its diet was meticulously calculated and incredibly costly. Historical household accounts from English castles record warhorses receiving staggering daily allotments, up to 12 pounds of oats or even more, supplemented by the highest quality hay. This was not mere indulgence, it was a non-negotiable military expenditure. A knight riding a poorly fed, lethargic horse into battle was a knight headed for an early grave. The grain ration was, therefore, a direct investment in combat effectiveness and personal survival. This system created a visible food chain that mirrored the feudal structure itself, from the grain-fed nobility of the horse world down to the hay-dependent commoners. Yet, the marshals and grooms who administered this system were acutely aware of its double-edged nature. They understood with grim clarity the catastrophic consequences of overfeeding grain, even if they didn't know the modern scientific terms for the resulting ailments. They observed that a horse suddenly given a large meal of grain after a period of rest could become violently ill, suffering from severe belly pain, sweating, and relentless pawing at the ground. They called this the gripes, or simply, surfeit, but we know it today as colic, a potentially fatal condition where the gut becomes impacted or twisted. They also recognized a more subtle and insidious danger, one particularly associated with overconsumption of rich spring grass or excessive grain: founder. A horse afflicted in this way would stand with a painful, rocking back stance, reluctant to move, its hooves hot to the touch. This was laminitis, a devastating inflammation of the sensitive tissues inside the hoof which, in severe cases, could cause the very bone within to rotate and protrude through the sole, necessitating the animal's destruction. The medieval response to these conditions was a testament to their practical wisdom. They practiced a form of preventative medicine we still adhere to. They introduced any dietary changes with extreme gradualism, allowing the horse's digestive system days or even weeks to adapt. Furthermore, they developed a crucial management technique. They never worked a hard-fed horse immediately after a large grain meal. Understanding that digestion required energy and blood flow, they would feed the bulk of the oats after the day's labor was complete, or provide a smaller, breakfast ration several hours before exercise began. This practice prevented a host of metabolic and muscular issues, showcasing a profound observation-based understanding of equine physiology. To manage the risk, they also employed clever processing methods. While whole oats were common, they often would crush, bruise, or even boil them to create a mash. This not only made the nutrients more easily accessible, especially for older horses or those with dental issues, but it also increased the volume with the addition of water, which helped prevent the horse from bolting its food too quickly and improved overall hydration. This intricate dance with grain harnessing its incredible power while meticulously sidestepping its inherent dangers was one of the highest skills in the medieval horse master's arsenal. It was a daily calculation of workload, status, and individual constitution, a balancing act where a single misjudgment could topple a fortune and end a life. With the complex matters of shelter and nutrition addressed, we turn to the most fundamental element of all, water. In our modern world, providing clean water is as simple as turning a tap, but for the medieval stable, it was a relentless, physically demanding logistical operation that had to be repeated every single day, often multiple times. The primary vessels for this essential task were deceptively simple: Wooden buckets and stone troughs. A wooden bucket, crafted by a cooper from tight-fitting staves bound with iron hoops, was the workhorse of the stable. It was portable, relatively lightweight, and could be easily carried by a groom to individual stalls. However, wood is porous and can harbor bacteria. To combat this, buckets were scrubbed clean with sand and water regularly and were often scalded with boiling water to sanitize them, a crude but effective form of sterilization. For larger groups of animals, especially in a castle's main stable yard or a communal village watering spot, a stone trough was the more permanent solution. Hewn from a single block of sandstone or limestone, these troughs were heavy, durable, and impervious to the gnawing of board horses. Their sheer mass also helped to keep the water within cooler during the summer heat. But whether the water was presented in wood or stone, the challenge was the same. Someone had to physically draw it, by the bucketful, from a well, a spring, or a nearby river, and transport it to the stable. For a large aristocratic household maintaining 30, 40, or even 50 horses, this was a staggering amount of labor. Imagine the constant procession of grooms, hauling heavy, sloshing buckets from a well that might be hundreds of yards away, filling troughs and buckets that would be empty again in a few hours. This Sisyphean task required a significant portion of the stable staff's daily effort, a hidden labor cost behind every hydrated animal. Yet, this physical challenge was straightforward compared to the intricate, and to our eyes, peculiar beliefs that governed when and how a horse was allowed to drink. The medieval marshal operated under a firm and near-universal conviction. Allowing a horse that was hot, sweaty, and winded from exertion to drink large quantities of cold water was a recipe for disaster. They believed this shocking temperature change could cause the animal to seize up internally, leading to a condition they called water founder, or the chill. The symptoms they observed, colic, stiffness, laminitis, were very real, but their understanding of the cause was slightly off. We now know that the primary risk isn't the water's temperature, but the simple volume of water consumed too quickly by a dehydrated horse, which can disrupt gut function and electrolyte balance. Nevertheless, their prescribed solution was a masterpiece of practical caution born from this misunderstood cause. The golden rule was to never offer water to a horse immediately upon returning from hard work. Instead, the animal was first walked gently until its breathing settled and its coat was no longer lathered. Only then would a groom offer a few sips of water, often from a bucket held in his hands so he could control the intake. After this initial, cautious drink, the horse would be allowed to fully cool down before being given free access to water. This practice, while rooted in an incorrect theory, had the perfectly correct effect of preventing the horse from gulping down a dangerous amount of water all at once. This careful philosophy extended to the order of operations at mealtime as well. Another firmly held stable management rule was to offer water before feeding grain, not after. The logic was that a thirsty horse would eat its oats first and then drink heavily immediately afterwards, causing the dry grain to swell precipitously inside its stomach, leading to colic and potentially a fatal torsion. By allowing the horse to slake its thirst first, they ensured the animal would eat its concentrated meal more slowly and deliberately, with a comfortably hydrated digestive system. This attention to the sequence of care, water, then rest, then feed, reveals a nuanced, holistic understanding of the horse's body that transcended their limited scientific knowledge. They may have attributed the illnesses to spirits or an imbalance of humors, but their preventative rituals were honed by generations of painful observation and loss. They knew that with something as seemingly simple as a drink of water, timing and moderation were everything, turning the daily act of hydration into a carefully choreographed ritual of life and death. All this meticulous attention to a horse's housing and diet would have been for nothing, however, if the single most critical point of contact between the animal and its world, its hooves, were allowed to fall into disrepair. This brings us to one of the most essential and respected craftsmen in the medieval world, the farrier. He was far more than a simple blacksmith. He was a hybrid expert, a fusion of veterinarian, anatomist, and master metalworker, whose skill directly determined whether a horse could walk, work, or wage war without crippling pain. The forge was his clinic, and the anvil his operating table. His most fundamental task, the one that underpinned everything else, was the regular trimming of the hoof. A horse's hoof is made of keratin, the same material as our fingernails, and it grows continuously. In the wild, constant movement across abrasive terrain wears it down naturally. But for a domesticated horse, especially one that spent significant time on soft bedding or traveled mostly on grassy tracks, this natural wear was insufficient. The hoof would overgrow, cracking and splitting, forcing the bones and tendons within the leg into unnatural, stressful angles that led to chronic lameness. The farrier's first job was to correct this with his specialized tools. A sharp, curved knife called a hoof knife for paring away dead sole, and a pair of massive, lever-like pincers known as hoof nippers to clip away excess wall length. He had to possess an intuitive understanding of the internal anatomy of the foot, knowing exactly how much to trim to restore the proper angle and balance without cutting into the sensitive, blood-rich structures within. A single slip of the knife could lame the animal for weeks, or even permanently, making the farrier's work a high-stakes exercise in precision and trust. This regular maintenance was the baseline of equine podiatry, a non-negotiable service for any horse-owning society. But the true revolution, the innovation that transformed the capabilities of the medieval horse, was the application of a forged iron shoe. This simple-looking arc of metal solved a devastatingly simple problem. Hooves wear down faster than they grow when subjected to the relentless friction of paved roads, stony mountain passes, and the hard-packed earth of busy towns. Without protection, a horse on a long journey or a military campaign would effectively be walking on its toenails until they were worn to the quick, leaving it lame, useless, and in agony long before its muscles or wind gave out. The horseshoe changed the entire equation. It acted as a sacrificial layer, taking the wear and tear so the hoof didn't have to. This single advancement dramatically extended a horse's useful working life, turning a potentially one-season campaigner into an asset that could serve for years. The process of fitting a shoe was a carefully orchestrated ritual of strength and skill. The farrier would first clean the hoof thoroughly, then select a pre-forged shoe from his rack or heat a bar of iron in his forge to craft a custom one. He would hold the red-hot shoe against the bottom of the hoof, creating a plume of acrid-smelling smoke as it seared the surface. This hot fitting wasn't just for show, it allowed him to perfectly seat the shoe, burning a precise impression into the hard hoof wall so that the metal sat flush with no pressure points. Once cooled, the shoe was nailed on. This is the part that seems counterintuitive and even cruel to the modern observer, driving nails into what appears to be a living part of the animal. But the farrier's genius lay in his knowledge of the hoof's anatomy. The outer wall has no nerves. It's like the tip of your fingernail. The farrier angled the nails outward, driving them through this insensitive layer so that they emerged on the sides of the hoof, where they were then bent over and clenched down, known as clinching, to create a secure, permanent hold. A well-shod horse felt no pain from the process, only the profound relief of stable, balanced footing. Yet, for such a pivotal technology, its origins and adoption in the Middle Ages are shrouded in a fascinating historical mystery. We know that the Romans used a type of hippo sandal, a leather and metal boot that was tied onto the hoof, but these were likely temporary and impractical for widespread use. The nailed iron horseshoe, as we recognize it, seems to have emerged in northern Europe around the 9th or 10th century, but the exact timeline is hotly debated by archaeologists. The problem is one of evidence. Iron is highly perishable. It rusts away to nothing in most soils, leaving only vague stains in the earth. Furthermore, a horseshoe, once worn out, would have been a valuable piece of scrap metal, melted down and reforged into a new tool or weapon. The primary archaeological evidence comes not from the shoes themselves, but from the nails, which are slightly more likely to be lost and buried. The sudden, widespread appearance of these distinct horseshoe nails in excavation layers at medieval sites is what signals the technology's adoption. But why then? Why did this brilliant idea become standard across Europe in the early medieval period? The prevailing theory points to a perfect storm of necessity and capability. This was the era of castle building and the consolidation of feudal kingdoms, which required the movement of heavy goods and armies over increasingly long distances on improved, but often stony road systems. Simultaneously, advances in blacksmithing techniques and the greater availability of iron, thanks to improved mining and smelting, made it economically feasible to produce these complex metal objects in large numbers. It was a solution whose time had come, a technological tipping point that unlocked the full potential of the horse, paving the way, quite literally, for the economic and military expansions that would define the High Middle Ages. Now that we understand the importance of the horseshoe itself, we can appreciate that it was far from a one-size-fits-all object. The medieval farrier was, in effect, a master of specialization, crafting distinct types of shoes tailored to the specific demands of a horse's occupation, much like a modern athlete would choose different footwear for running, hiking, or playing soccer. For the heavy cavalry destrier, the primary concern was stability and traction on the treacherous, churned-up ground of a battlefield or tournament list. Their shoes were often substantial, made from thicker iron bar stock to withstand the immense concussion of a fully armored charge. A common feature was the addition of raised, sharpened edges on the ground surface, known as calkins or heel cauls. These acted like cleats, biting into the mud and turf to prevent the horse from slipping during a violent turn, or when bracing to absorb the impact of a lance strike. Sometimes, a single large calkin was forged on the outside heel of the hind shoes to provide an extra anchor point for pushing off. For travel over long distances, the smooth-gated palfrey prized by nobles and merchants required a very different solution. The priority here was comfort and durability on established roadways. Their shoes were typically lighter and smoother, designed to provide protection without adding unnecessary weight that would fatigue the animal over miles of travel. The design was more about even wear and maintaining the health of the hoof during sustained, but less explosive exertion. Then we have the agricultural world, where the humble cart horse or plow horse needed a shoe that was first and foremost practical and economical. These were often the simplest and cheapest to produce, sometimes even remade from old, worn-out shoes from the knight's stable. Their design focused on basic protection for hooves that spent hours each day on soft, yielding earth, though they still needed to be robust enough for the occasional trip on a stony track to the market town. Beyond these broad categories, there were truly specialized designs that hint at the ingenuity of the period. For horses that had to regularly traverse icy paths in northern climates or traverse steep, rocky mountain passes, farriers sometimes crafted shoes with special additions. There is evidence, though debated, of shoes with small, screw-in metal spikes for ice, and others with a more grooved or roughened surface to improve grip on slippery stone. The material itself was almost universally wrought iron, prized for its toughness and ability to be worked hot by a skilled smith. While we might imagine rare war horses sporting shoes of silver or bronze for show, the reality for 99 out of 100 horses was functional, unadorned iron. The process of creating the shoe was a spectacle of its own. The farrier would heat a straight iron bar in his forge until it glowed a brilliant orange, then skillfully hammer it over the horn of his anvil, bending it into a graceful curve and punching the nail holes with a specialized tool called a pritchel. Each step was a blend of brute force and delicate precision, resulting in a custom-fitted device that was quite literally the foundation of medieval mobility. This variety in design speaks to a profound understanding of equine biomechanics long before the term existed. They knew that the needs of a horse pulling a plow were fundamentally different from those of a horse carrying a knight in full-plate armor, and their craftsmanship reflected this nuanced, practical wisdom. This specialization, however, makes tracking the horseshoe's history all the more complex for modern archaeologists. If the designs varied so much by region and purpose, how can we pinpoint exactly when this transformative technology became commonplace across Europe? The evidence is not found in grand historical texts, but in the silent, often cryptic, clues left in the ground. The central problem is that iron corrodes. A horseshoe lost in a muddy field 1,000 years ago will, in most soil conditions, rust away completely, leaving behind only a reddish-brown stain in the earth, a ghost of its former self. This is why the discovery of a fully intact medieval horseshoe is a rare and exciting event for archaeologists. More often, the evidence comes from the nails. Horseshoe nails, with their distinctive rectangular shank and tapered point, are slightly more common finds. While the shoe itself might be recycled as scrap metal, a bent or broken nail was often simply discarded where it fell. When archaeologists excavate a site like a medieval smithy, a castle midden, or a river crossing, finding a concentration of these specific nails in a particular layer of soil is a strong indicator that horses were being shod in that location at that time. By using techniques like stratigraphy, carefully analyzing which layer of soil an object is found in, and radiocarbon dating of organic material in the same layer, historians can build a tentative timeline. The current consensus, pieced together from thousands of such scattered finds, suggests that the nailed iron horseshoe saw widespread adoption across northern and western Europe between the 9th and 11th centuries. But this timeline is hotly contested. Some scholars point to sporadic finds from the Roman era or the early migration period, arguing for a much earlier, though inconsistent, use. The debate hinges on distinguishing between a unique, local innovation and a true, society-wide technological adoption. The key likely lies in a convergence of factors. The early medieval period saw a dramatic increase in long-distance trade and the movement of armies, both of which demanded more from the horse. At the same time, advances in mining and smelting made iron more readily available and affordable. It was the meeting of a pressing need with the practical means to fulfill it that propelled the horseshoe from a rare luxury to an essential component of daily life. So, while we may never know the name of the first brilliant smith who hammered a nail into a hoof, the legacy of their innovation is clear. It was the horseshoe that ultimately hardened the hoof of the medieval world, allowing it to travel further, carry heavier loads, and campaign longer, permanently altering the pace of history itself with every secure metal-shod step. After ensuring their hooves were properly shod and protected, the daily attention to a medieval horse shifted upwards, to the care of its skin, coat, and muscles through a rigorous grooming ritual. This was not a casual brushing for the sake of appearance. It was a mandatory, non-negotiable health inspection and therapeutic massage, a daily diagnostic procedure as critical as any modern veterinary checkup. The tools of this trade were simple, yet each had a specific and vital purpose. The process would typically begin with the currycomb, a versatile implement often made from wood, bone, or even a section of knuckly bone with grooves carved into it. The groom would use this in a firm, circular motion all over the horse's body, working to loosen caked-on mud, dried sweat, and dead skin. This action was the equivalent of a deep exfoliation, stimulating blood flow to the skin's surface and bringing fresh oxygen and nutrients to the hair follicles, which promoted a healthier, more resilient coat. More importantly, this vigorous rubbing encouraged the production and distribution of the horse's natural oils. These oils, secreted from the skin, were its built-in waterproofing and insulating system. By spreading them evenly through the coat, the groom ensured the animal could effectively shed rainwater and maintain a stable body temperature against both cold and heat. Following the currycomb came the dandy brush, typically fashioned with stiff, natural bristles set into a wooden block. This brush was used with short, flicking strokes to whisk away all the dirt and debris that the currycomb had loosened. Watching a skilled groom at work was like seeing a painter. Each stroke had purpose, lifting the dust and dirt up and out of the coat, leaving it clean and allowing the skin to breathe. The final touch for the body was the soft body brush, made with finer bristles, which would sweep away the last particles of dust and leave the coat lying smooth and glossy. The mane and tail received their own dedicated attention with a wide-toothed comb, often carved from wood or bone. Carefully working through the long hairs prevented painful tangles and mats, which could tear and thin the hair over time. But this detangling was about more than aesthetics. A clean, well-kept tail was the horse's primary defense against flies and other biting insects in the summer months. Every minute of this process served a dual purpose. While the groom's hands were moving through the coat, their eyes were conducting a meticulous, inch-by-inch survey of the entire animal. They were searching for the subtle signs a busy owner might miss: a fresh swelling from a kick in the stable, a hot, tender spot signaling the beginning of an abscess, a small cut from a bramble that could fester into a serious infection, or the telltale scabs and hair loss that revealed an infestation of lice or mites. Discovering a problem early, before it could escalate, was the entire point. A patch of skin that was raw or a set of puffy legs noticed during grooming could be treated immediately with a poultice or a salve, preventing a minor issue from becoming a career-ending lameness or a life-threatening fever. This daily hands-on contact also forged an intangible bond of trust between the groom and the horse. A horse that was accustomed to being handled all over its body was far calmer and more manageable for the farrier, the veterinarian, and most importantly, its rider in the chaos of a hunt or a battle. A knight needed to know his horse would stand steady amidst the noise and terror of combat, and that unshakable discipline was cultivated in the quiet, repetitive moments of the grooming ritual. For the warhorse especially, this routine took on an almost sacred significance. Before a tournament or a battle, the grooming would be especially thorough. Every strap of the saddle and bridle would lie against a perfectly clean coat, because even a single grain of sand or a tiny mat of hair, trapped under the pressure of armor, could rub a painful sore that would worsen with hours of movement, distracting the horse and compromising its performance at a critical moment. The gleaming coat of a well-groomed destrier was not a sign of vanity. It was the outward proof of a deeply integrated system of care, a visible guarantee that the animal had been inspected, cared for, and prepared to the highest standard. It was the final, essential step in ensuring that the immense investment in stable, feed, and shoeing was fully realized in a healthy, responsive, and dependable partner. Yet all this meticulous care for the horse itself would have been wasted if the very tools used to control and ride it were allowed to fall into disrepair. This brings us into the heart of the medieval stable's inner sanctum, the tack room. This was not a chaotic closet for dumping gear. It was a highly organized and scrupulously maintained space, a workshop dedicated to preserving the integrity of leather and metal. The work performed here was a daily, non-negotiable ritual, typically assigned to squires and grooms as a fundamental part of their training, instilling in them a respect for the equipment that was as vital as the horse itself. The primary material demanding attention was leather. A saddle, bridle, and girth were not just accessories. They were complex systems of straps and panels under immense physical stress. A saddle had to bear the weight of an armored knight. A bridle had to withstand the powerful pressure of a horse fighting the bit, and a girth had to hold everything securely without breaking or chafing. When leather became wet with sweat or rain and was then left to dry naturally, it would harden, becoming brittle and prone to cracking at the seams. A single cracked strap on a bridle could snap at the worst possible moment, while a stiff, unyielding saddle could rub the horse's back raw in minutes, creating a painful sore that would make it impossible to ride for weeks. To prevent this, the first step after every use was a thorough cleaning. The squire would use a damp sponge or rag to wipe away every trace of sweat, saliva, and grime from the leather. Once clean and dry, the preservation process began. They would work a special dressing, often a blend of animal fats like lard or tallow, or plant-based oils, deep into the grain of the leather with their bare hands. This was not a superficial wipe. It was a massage that replenished the leather's natural oils, keeping it supple, strong, and resistant to moisture. This regular oiling prevented the leather from drying out and rotting, dramatically extending its life and ensuring it remained safe and reliable. A well-oiled piece of leather had a distinctive, rich smell and a dark, pliable texture, a mark of pride for the groom who maintained it. The storage of this leather was equally deliberate. Saddles were placed on specially shaped wooden brackets called saddle trees that supported their shape, preventing them from warping. Bridles were hung from pegs, not thrown in a heap, to ensure the straps remained straight and untangled. This careful storage prevented the permanent creases and weaknesses that could lead to catastrophic failure. The metal components, particularly the bit that sat inside the horse's mouth, required an even more rigorous level of care. The bit was the primary communication point between the rider's hands and the horse's mind. A dirty or rusty bit was not just unpleasantly, it was a vector for disease. Rust, which is essentially iron oxide, creates a rough, pitted surface perfect for trapping bacteria from the horse's saliva. When placed back in the mouth, this contaminated metal could cause infections on the delicate gums and tongue, leading to painful ulcers that would make the horse resistant to the bit and difficult to control. To prevent this, the metal was scrubbed clean after every single use. A squire would use sand, ashes, or a rough stone to scour every millimeter of the bit until it was perfectly smooth and shiny, then rinse it thoroughly. In wealthier households, they might even polish it with a cloth to ensure no moisture-retaining residue remained. This was a task that required immense attention to detail, checking the joints of a snaffle bit or the intricate links of a curb chain for any hidden corrosion. The failure to perform this simple act could lead to a chain reaction. A mouth infection would cause pain. The pain would make the horse head shy and uncooperative, and an uncooperative warhorse on a battlefield was a liability that could get its rider killed. This daily maintenance of tack, therefore, was never seen as a lowly chore. It was a foundational discipline. For a squire aspiring to knighthood, the care of his lord's gear was a physical lesson in responsibility and an intimate understanding of the tools of his future trade. The supple leather and the gleaming, sterile bit were not just signs of a well-run stable. They were the final, critical pieces of a vast and interconnected system, ensuring that when the moment came to ride out, the bond between horse and rider was one of comfort, trust, and flawless communication. Overseeing this entire symphony of specialized care, from the forge of the farrier to the daily grooming in the stable, was a single, pivotal figure whose authority was absolute, the marshalsea, or master of the horse. In a great noble household or on a royal estate, this individual was not merely a senior groom. He was a high-ranking officer, a member of the lord's inner circle whose word on all matters equine was law. His title often derived from the marshalsea, the department of the household dedicated to the horses and transport, and his responsibilities were staggering. He managed the entire stable staff, controlled the budget for feed, blacksmithing, and equipment, and was the final arbiter of which horses were purchased, bred, or retired. But his most crucial and respected function was that of chief physician. The marshalsea was the veterinarian's direct ancestor, a walking library of practical knowledge accumulated over a lifetime and passed down through an informal system of apprenticeship from one generation to the next. His understanding of anatomy was not derived from textbooks, but from a hands-on, visceral familiarity gained from 1,000 hours spent handling, treating, and, when necessary, dissecting animals. He knew the precise feel of a healthy tendon, the sound of clear lungs, and the subtle change in a horse's stance that signaled the first whisper of lameness. This knowledge was a potent blend of sharp observation and inherited wisdom, a compilation of what worked, refined through a process of relentless trial and error. He operated according to a system that seems deeply contradictory to the modern mind, one that seamlessly blended what we would recognize as sound science with beliefs we would dismiss as pure superstition. On one hand, his treatments could be remarkably effective and grounded in a logical understanding of the natural world. He knew that a poultice of warm bran and linseed could draw out infection from an abscess, that chewing on willow bark, a natural source of salicin, the precursor to aspirin, could ease a horse's pain and fever, and that rest was the only true cure for a bowed tendon. He understood the principles of contagion well enough to quarantine a new horse arriving at the stable for several weeks to ensure it wasn't carrying a disease like strangles, and he practiced a form of physiotherapy, using massage and controlled exercise to rehabilitate injured muscles. Yet, his worldview was also shaped by the prevailing beliefs of his time, which attributed many illnesses not to bacteria or viruses, but to an imbalance of the four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, or to malign influences like curses or evil winds. A sudden, unexplained illness might be diagnosed as an excess of phlegm, requiring a heating treatment, or it might be seen as the result of a witch's malevolent gaze. His pharmacopoeia was just as blended. It contained genuinely useful items like honey, used for its natural antiseptic properties to pack a wound, or comfrey, known as knit bone, for its ability to reduce swelling and aid the healing of fractures. But sitting alongside these were more esoteric ingredients. A remedy for a respiratory ailment might include not just soothing horehound, but also the powdered tooth of a wolf, believed to lend fierceness and vitality to the afflicted animal. A charm to protect a horse from the evil eye might be written on a piece of parchment and sewn into its bridle. We must understand that for the Marshalsea, this was not a conflict between science and magic. In his mind, it was all part of a single, coherent system. The herbal poultice addressed the physical manifestation of the ailment, while the charm or the strange ingredient addressed its perceived spiritual cause. If a treatment worked, whether due to the active properties of the herb or the powerful placebo effect it had on the human caregivers, it was incorporated into his canon of reliable practices. The success of a Marshalsea, and indeed the survival of the valuable animals in his charge, hinged on his ability to discern which practices produced consistent results. Over a long career, he would quietly drop the remedies that repeatedly failed, while fiercely guarding the ones that seemed to work, creating a personalized and highly prized body of knowledge. This made him an indispensable and powerful figure. A lord's military power and personal mobility rested on the health of his stables, and he entrusted that power to the Marshalsea. The position demanded a rare combination of brute strength, deep empathy for the animals, shrewd managerial skill, and the intuitive wisdom of a healer. He was the ultimate synthesizer, a man who stood at the crossroads of emerging science, ancient tradition, and daily necessity, holding the well-being of the medieval world's most crucial partners squarely in his capable, and often mysterious, hands. Armed with their intimate knowledge and a deep, almost intuitive connection to their animals, the medieval Marshalsea would begin every diagnosis not with a test or a machine, but with the most fundamental tool at his disposal, his own senses. He was a master of observation, trained to read the subtle, silent language of the horse's body with a clarity that modern veterinarians, for all their advanced technology, would deeply respect. The process began the moment he stepped into the stable. He wasn't just looking at the horse, he was reading its entire presence. Was it standing alert and interested in its surroundings, or was it listless, standing with its head hung low in a dark corner of the stall? This initial impression of demeanor, or what they often called spirit, was the first crucial data point. A horse that was off its feed, leaving its morning oats untouched, was immediately flagged for a more thorough examination, as a loss of appetite was the universal first signal that something was wrong internally. From this broad assessment, his examination would become intensely focused, moving over the animal's body in a systematic, practiced routine. He would start at the head, gently taking the horse's face in his hands to look directly into its eyes. He wasn't just checking for clarity, he was looking for a story. Bright, clear eyes with a soft, moist shine indicated vitality and good health. But eyes that were sunken, dry, or had a dull, glazed film over them spoke of dehydration, fever, or profound exhaustion. A yellowish tinge to the whites could point to liver troubles, while a discharge from the corner of the eye might signal anything from a simple irritation to a more serious respiratory infection. Next, his attention would turn to the coat, running his hands through it not just to feel for lumps, but to assess its very texture. A healthy coat should lie flat and smooth, with a natural, oily sheen that felt slick to the touch. A coat that was standing on end, staring, was a major red flag. This was the body's attempt to trap air and create insulation, a sure sign of fever or a severe chill. If the hair felt dry, brittle, and lacked its natural luster, it often indicated malnutrition or a chronic digestive issue preventing the proper absorption of nutrients. He would then gently lift the horse's lip to examine the gums. This simple act was their equivalent of a blood test. Healthy gums should be a moist, bubble gum pink. Pale whitish gums were a terrifying sight, signaling blood loss or severe anemia. Dark red, inflamed gums could point to infection or toxicity, and a bluish or purple tint was a dire emergency, indicating poor circulation and a starved oxygen supply, often a precursor to death. All of this was done while listening to the horse's breathing, his ear close to its nostrils and flank. The normal, resting respiration of a healthy horse is slow, steady, and almost silent. Any deviation, a rasp, a wheeze, a cough, or simply a rate that was too fast and shallow painted a vivid picture of distress within the lungs or the airway. Checking the pulse was another act of refined skill, performed without a stethoscope. The Marshalsea would press his fingers against the great artery that runs under the jawbone, feeling for the rhythm and strength of the heartbeat. A normal pulse was strong and steady, like a soft, consistent drumbeat. A pulse that was rapid and thready suggested pain, fear, or fever, while a pulse that was unusually slow and weak could indicate shock, internal bleeding, or a failing heart. The final, and perhaps most telling, part of the physical exam involved the legs and hooves. He would run his hands down each leg, from the shoulder to the hoof, feeling for any heat, swelling, or tenderness that the horse would flinch from. Heat in a single leg, especially when compared to the others, almost always localized an injury, a sprain, a strain, or the beginnings of an abscess in the hoof. To check for the dreaded laminitis, or founder, he would use a pincer test, gently squeezing the hoof wall with a pair of hoof testers or even just his strong hands. If the horse pulled away in pain, it confirmed the agonizing inflammation within the foot. This entire diagnostic process was a breathtaking synthesis of sensory information. The Marshalsea was constantly cross-referencing what he saw, felt, and heard. A feverish temperature suggested by a hot, staring coat would be confirmed by a rapid pulse and dry gums. A limp noticed in the stable yard would be traced to a specific hot, painful leg during the hands-on exam. This was not guesswork. It was a rigorous, logical deduction based on a deep, accumulated understanding of cause and effect. He was connecting the dots between external symptoms and their internal causes, building a case for what was wrong based on a lifetime of evidence gathered from hundreds of horses. This profound skill, this ability to listen to a story told not in words, but in the quiet language of the body, was the true art of the medieval horse healer, a form of living diagnosis that technology has supplemented, but can never truly replace. With the horse's condition accurately assessed, the Marshalsea would turn to his most trusted resource, the herbalist's satchel. This was not merely a collection of random weeds, but a portable apothecary filled with nature's most potent remedies, each plant selected through generations of careful observation for its specific therapeutic properties. The medieval understanding of herbalism was a complex web of practical knowledge, symbolic associations, and inherited wisdom, meticulously recorded in handwritten husbandry manuals that were among the most valuable and closely guarded texts in any noble household. These manuals, with titles like the Book of Marshalsea, or appearing as sections within larger works on estate management, were the repositories of collective experience, detailing which herb to use, when to harvest it for maximum potency, and precisely how to prepare it. The Marshalsea's reliance on these texts underscores a crucial point. This was not a haphazard process of trial and error, but a systematic, recorded science of its time, passed down from master to apprentice with the gravity of a sacred trust. One of the most universally respected plants in this natural pharmacy was comfrey, a robust herb with hairy leaves and clusters of bell-shaped flowers. Known affectionately as knit bone or boneset, its reputation for healing was legendary. The Marshalsea would harvest the large, rough leaves and the thick, black roots to create a poultice for serious wounds. He would chop the fresh plant material into a pulp, often mixing it with a little hot water or even egg white to form a sticky paste, and then pack it directly into deep cuts or around fractured bones once they were set. We now know that comfrey contains allantoin, a chemical compound that dramatically accelerates cell regeneration, effectively promoting the rapid healing of both skin and bone. The medieval healer didn't know the word allantoin, but he knew with absolute certainty that a comfrey poultice applied to a sword cut on a horse's flank would close the wound with remarkable speed and cleanly, preventing the festering and proud flesh that could otherwise lead to a fatal infection. For the management of pain and inflammation, willow bark was the go-to remedy. The Marshalsea would strip the inner bark from young willow branches, dry it, and then pound it into a coarse powder. This powder could be mixed into the horse's feed or brewed into a bitter-tasting tea that was administered with a horn or a bottle. The active ingredient in willow bark is salicin, which the liver converts into salicylic acid, the fundamental chemical precursor to the aspirin we use today. When a warhorse returned from a hard campaign with swollen, inflamed tendons or a fever from an infected wound, a dose of willow bark tea would reliably reduce its fever and ease its discomfort, allowing the animal to rest and recover. This was a powerful analgesic and anti-inflammatory, pulled directly from the riverbank. Another staple of the stable's medicine chest was garlic, a pungent bulb with a reputation that stretched back to the ancient world. The Marshalsea understood that horses, like people, were plagued by internal parasites, worms that could steal nutrients, cause colic, and generally weaken the animal. They would regularly add crushed garlic cloves to the horse's grain ration as a preventative treatment. While we might smile at the simplicity, modern studies have confirmed that garlic possesses potent antimicrobial and anthelmintic, or anti-worm, properties. The sulfur compounds in garlic, which give it its strong odor, can help expel parasites from the digestive tract. It was a natural, effective vermifuge that helped keep the horse's internal system clear of invaders. Beyond these specific stars, the herbal repertoire was vast and nuanced. Meadowsweet, with its fluffy white flowers and sweet aroma, was another source of salicylates, often used as a gentler alternative to willow bark for treating arthritic pain in older horses. The sticky, yellow sap of the greater celandine was applied to warts and sarcoids on the skin. For respiratory ailments, they would turn to herbs like horehound or coltsfoot, which have expectorant qualities to help clear phlegm from the lungs. The preparation methods were as important as the plants themselves. A poultice for a swollen joint might involve heating the herbs and wrapping them in a cloth to hold the heat and moisture against the skin, drawing out inflammation. A drawing salve for an abscess could be made from bread and milk poultice, which would soften the skin and encourage the infection to come to a head. These husbandry manuals provided intricate instructions, specifying whether to use a plant fresh or dried, which part, root, leaf, or flower was most potent, and the exact time of year to harvest for the best effect. This deep, symbiotic relationship with the plant world reveals a sophisticated level of environmental literacy. The Marshalsea was a walking botanist, his eyes constantly scanning the hedgerows and meadows not for beauty, but for utility. He knew that the solution to most of the ailments he faced was likely growing within a short walk of his stable, a living pharmacy provided by nature, waiting only for his knowledgeable hand to cultivate its healing power. Yet for all their profound skill in diagnosis and herbalism, the medieval Marshalsea also wielded a set of tools and techniques that seem to us like instruments of torture, practices that highlight the perilous edge between healer and harm in a world still grappling with the fundamental causes of disease. These controversial cures, largely borrowed from the barber surgeons who treated human patients, were rooted in a medical framework that dominated Western thought for centuries, the theory of the four humors. This system proposed that health was a state of perfect balance between four vital fluids within the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Any sickness, whether in a man or a horse, was interpreted as an excess or corruption of one of these humors, and the goal of treatment was to purge the offending substance, thereby restoring the body's natural equilibrium. It was a perfectly logical system built on a completely flawed foundation, and it led to treatments that could be as brutally effective as they were misguided. The most common of these drastic interventions was bloodletting, or phlebotomy. The logic was straightforward. If a horse was suffering from a fever, inflammation, or a hot condition like a respiratory infection, it was believed to have a dangerous surplus of blood, the hot and moist humor. The solution was to deliberately open a vein and drain away a significant quantity of this excess. The procedure was precise. The Marshalsea would use a sharp, lance-shaped tool called a phleem, which was often spring-loaded to ensure a quick, clean incision into the jugular vein or another prominent blood vessel. The blood would be collected in a special bowl, and the quantity was carefully measured. Letting too much could weaken the animal beyond recovery, while letting too little would fail to rebalance the humors. In some cases, they practiced regional bloodletting, believing that draining blood from a vein near an afflicted area, like a swollen leg, would draw the corrupted humors directly from the site of the injury. From our modern perspective, the practice seems not just primitive but actively harmful. And indeed, for a horse already weakened by fever or blood loss from a wound, this additional drainage could easily push it into fatal shock. Yet, paradoxically, in certain very specific circumstances, this flawed theory could accidentally produce a beneficial result. For a horse suffering from laminitis, a condition involving intense inflammation within the hoof, the sudden reduction in blood volume from phlebotomy could temporarily lower blood pressure and reduce the painful pounding sensation in the feet, providing a few hours of relief. The Marshalsea, seeing this temporary improvement, would have his belief in the humoral system powerfully reinforced, completely unaware that the real mechanism was a reduction in circulatory pressure, not the expulsion of a mythical bad humor. This single observed success, however accidental, was enough to cement the practice for generations, blinding them to the many cases where it hastened an animal's decline. If bloodletting was the cure for an excess within, then the creation of a blister was the prescribed solution for a problem lying deep beneath the skin. For chronic lameness, persistent swelling, or ailments believed to be caused by cold humors like phlegm settling in the joints, the Marshalsea would turn to a horrific-sounding but logically consistent treatment: the intentional burning of the skin to stimulate a healing crisis. They would concoct a potent, caustic paste from ingredients like powdered cantharides, made from dried blister beetles, or a mixture of hot pitch and mustard. This paste was then smeared onto the shaved skin over the affected area, such as a bowed tendon or an arthritic hock. The chemicals would cause a severe second-degree burn, raising a massive, fluid-filled blister. The intense inflammation and pain were not seen as a side effect. They were the entire point of the therapy. The belief was that this powerful, artificial inflammation would draw the body's healing energies and the offending humors away from the deep internal problem and towards the surface of the skin. As the blister burst and wept, it was thought to be draining the corrupted fluids from the body. After the blister had run its course, leaving a raw, oozing wound, the Marshalsea would then apply soothing salves to encourage the skin to heal, hoping that the underlying condition had been resolved in the process. The pain inflicted on the animal was immense, and the risk of a severe secondary infection was high. Yet again, there is a sliver of twisted logic that modern veterinary physiotherapy can almost recognize. The intense inflammatory response did indeed increase blood flow to the general area, and in some cases of chronic, stagnant soft tissue injury, this dramatic stimulus may have sometimes jolted a sluggish healing process into action. It was a brutal, risky, and desperate attempt to achieve what we now do with therapeutic lasers and targeted massage: a sledgehammer approach where a scalpel was needed. Perhaps the most extreme and perplexing of all these invasive procedures was the insertion of a seton. This involved taking a length of cord, often made of silk or a strip of linen cloth, and deliberately threading it through a fold of the horse's skin, typically at the crest of the neck or between the forelegs. A large surgical needle would be used to pull the cord through, and the two ends would then be tied together to form a loop, leaving the foreign material permanently embedded in the living tissue. The goal was to create a controlled, chronic infection. The body would recognize the seton as a foreign invader and would constantly produce pus and fluid in an attempt to expel it, creating a perpetual draining wound. This was considered a highly desirable outcome. The Marshalsea believed this constant discharge was a way to vent evil humors and morbid matter from the body over a long period, acting as a sort of safety valve for the animal's health. It was a preventative measure as much as a curative one, thought to protect against everything from lethargy and eye diseases to recurring fevers by providing a permanent outlet for bad influences. The seton would be left in place for weeks or even months, with the groom regularly pulling the cord back and forth to irritate the tissue and ensure the flow of pus continued. The fact that a horse could often continue to work with a seton in place, seemingly unaffected by this grotesque accessory, was taken as proof of its efficacy. In reality, the animal was simply enduring a low-grade managed infection, its immune system perpetually distracted by a self-inflicted wound. What we see in these three practices, bloodletting, blistering, and setons, is the dark side of medieval empiricism. These were not random acts of cruelty. They were systematic interventions based on a coherent, widely accepted medical theory. The Marshalsea was applying what he genuinely believed to be the most advanced science of his age. He observed that sometimes, against all odds, the animal did recover following these brutal treatments. Those rare successes, burned into his memory, overshadowed the countless silent failures, reinforcing a cycle of practice that now seems barbaric. This is the ultimate paradox of medieval horse care. A deep, empathetic connection to the animal and a vast repository of effective herbal wisdom existed side by side with a willingness to inflict tremendous suffering in the name of healing. It reminds us that the history of medicine is not a straight line from ignorance to enlightenment, but a tangled path where compassion and cruelty were often guided by the same hand, wielding the same fleam. But even the most robust warhorse, a living mountain of muscle and bone, could not draw upon sheer power alone. To unleash the explosive charge that could shatter an enemy line, and to sustain that effort for the brutal hours of a medieval engagement, required a fuel of a different caliber entirely. This leads us to one of the most tantalizing and enduring mysteries of medieval equine care: the elite, secretive diet of the destrier. While the common rouncey or palfrey thrived on hay and a modest portion of oats, the knight's primary mount was the equivalent of a professional athlete, and its nutrition was a high-stakes science tailored to forge a creature of both immense strength and resilient stamina. The baseline of this diet was, of course, a prodigious quantity of the highest quality oats. Household accounts from the period are startlingly specific, recording war horses receiving daily rations of 12, 15, or even 20 pounds of oats. This grain provided the foundational carbohydrates for energy, but the true secret to building the dense, powerful musculature required to carry a knight in full-plate armor, which could easily exceed 300 pounds, likely involved a significant protein boost. We know that legumes like peas, beans, and vetches were commonly grown and were understood to produce a heating effect on the animals, making them more energetic and robust. It is highly probable that these protein-rich legumes were ground and mixed into the war horse's daily grain ration, essentially creating a primitive, high-performance feed concentrate designed for maximum muscle development and recovery. But this is where the historical record becomes fragmented and speculation begins to run wild. For centuries, a persistent and controversial theory has suggested that the most elite war horses were occasionally fed animal products. The idea is not as far-fetched as it might initially seem. We have scattered accounts from various cultures, including the Mongols, of horses being given dried meat or fat during long, arduous campaigns when grain was scarce. The logic is compelling. Fat is a more concentrated source of energy than carbohydrates, and protein is the building block of muscle. Could a European Knights Marshal, desperate to give his charge an edge, have secretly stirred a raw egg into its mash or even offered strips of dried, salted beef? The practical argument against this is the horse's digestive system, which is that of a dedicated herbivore, not designed to process large amounts of meat. However, small, supplemental quantities of animal fat or protein, particularly during the intense conditioning phase before a campaign or in the immediate recovery period after a battle, might have been tolerated and could have provided a noticeable, if mysterious, benefit. The marshal, observing his horse grow stronger and recover faster with this unorthodox supplement, would have guarded the knowledge as a powerful trade secret, an alchemical formula for creating a super equine. This practice would never have been widespread. It would have been far too costly and logistically nightmarish, but for a handful of champion destriers belonging to the wealthiest nobles, it remains a fascinating and plausible possibility. The greater and more constant challenge, however, was not the pre-battle conditioning, but the grim reality of maintaining this peak condition during an actual campaign. A military expedition was a marathon of deprivation, and the war horse's carefully calibrated diet was the first casualty. The sheer volume of fodder required was staggering. A conservative estimate suggests a single war horse needed at least 20 pounds of hay and 10 pounds of grain every day. For a contingent of just 100 knights, each with a primary mount and several lighter horses, this meant moving thousands of pounds of fodder each week. This logistical tail was the army's lifeline and its greatest vulnerability. While on the move through friendly territory, the marshals would send out foraging parties to purchase or simply seize hay and grain from local farms. But once they crossed into enemy lands or during a siege, this supply line could be severed. The landscape would be stripped bare by the advancing army, leaving nothing for the horses in the rear. This is when the carefully nurtured war horse faced its most severe trial. The animals would be forced to subsist on whatever poor quality grass they could find while picketed at night, or on leaves and even the bark from trees. Their conditioned bodies, used to a rich, high-octane diet, would quickly start to consume their own muscle and fat reserves. They would lose weight, their coats would grow dull, and their energy and spirit would plummet. A knight watching his magnificent destrier slowly waste away was witnessing the dissolution of his own combat power. The marshals had to become masters of improvisation, seeking out any available source of nutrition. They might lead the horses to graze in marshes for water-loving grasses, or feed them broad beans or chickpeas plundered from enemy stores, despite the known risk of digestive upset. In the most desperate circumstances, the very structure of the army might be dictated by the need for forage. A large force could not remain stationary for long without utterly consuming all the local resources, forcing constant movement simply to find fresh grazing land for the horses. This relentless cycle of feast and famine, of peak conditioning followed by grueling deprivation, meant that the lifespan of a working war horse was often brutally short. Only the most resilient animals, those with the toughest constitutions, could survive multiple campaigns. The ultimate testament to the skill of the medieval marshal, therefore, was not just his ability to build a perfect war horse in the safety of his home stable, but his desperate, daily fight to preserve even a shadow of that perfection in the face of hunger, exhaustion, and the unforgiving arithmetic of campaign logistics. This long-term dedication to forging the perfect equine partner leads us to one of the most fascinating and deliberate arts of the medieval world, the science of selective breeding. While we often picture knights simply choosing the biggest and strongest horses they could find, the reality was far more sophisticated. The medieval breeder was not a passive observer of nature. He was a sculptor of living flesh and bone, patiently working over generations to mold the raw material of the horse into specialized tools for a demanding society. This was a form of biological engineering, a slow and meticulous process where the traits of a single, exceptional stallion could shape the destiny of an entire region's cavalry for a century. The foundational principle was simple but profound, like begets-like. They understood that a fast, agile mare was more likely to produce foals with speed, and a massive, calm-tempered destrier would likely sire offspring with his immense strength. But their application of this principle was anything but simple. It required an encyclopedic knowledge of bloodlines and a visionary's eye for potential, seeing not just the animal in front of them, but the generations of horses it could create. The ultimate expression of this art was the great aristocratic stud farm, a place that was less a farm and more a highly secure, state-sponsored research and development center. These were not open pastures. They were often located on secluded, well-defended manors, with their prized stallions and broodmares guarded as closely as any royal treasure. The knowledge contained within these walls, which mares produced the best foals with which stallions, which bloodlines through reliable temperaments, which lines were prone to specific weaknesses, was a form of intellectual property more valuable than gold. A lord who possessed a renowned stud, like the famous royal studs of King John of England in the 13th century, held a strategic military asset that could directly influence the balance of power on the continent. The horses bred there were not for sale to just anyone. They were reserved for the king's most loyal barons and knights, ensuring that the crown's most powerful supporters were mounted on the best possible animals. The records kept at these establishments, though often fragmentary, show a meticulous attention to pedigree. The names of great sires were passed down through oral tradition and in carefully maintained ledger books, their prowess becoming the stuff of legend. To own a descendant of a celebrated warhorse like Bayard or Barbary was to own a piece of that legend, a living inheritance of power and prestige. The results of this centuries-long project were not one generic, medieval horse, but a stunning array of specialized types, each a masterpiece of form following function. At the pinnacle stood the destrier, the ultimate product of this breeding program. This was not a breed in the modern sense, like a thoroughbred or an Arabian, but a type, a phenotype achieved by crossing the largest, most powerful native European mares with imported stallions believed to carry the desired traits. The goal was uncompromising, to create a living tank. A perfect destrier was broad-chested to house massive lungs and a powerful heart, with incredibly thick, strong bones in its legs to withstand the concussion of the charge and the weight of its own barding, or horse armor. Its hindquarters were immense, providing the explosive power needed to launch a fully armored knight forward into a gallop. Its temperament was as carefully selected as its physique. It needed to be courageous enough to stand steady in the screaming chaos of battle, yet manageable enough for its rider to control with subtle cues. This was a specialist weapon, as purpose-built and expensive as a custom-made suit of plate armor. But the medieval world needed more than just battlefield champions. For the nobility and wealthy merchants who spent long hours in the saddle traveling between their scattered estates, comfort and endurance were the priorities. This gave rise to the palfrey, the luxury sedan of its day. Bred for a smooth, comfortable gait known as an amble or a pace, where the legs on each side of the horse moved together, the palfrey provided a ride that was far less jolting than the trot of a typical horse. This made long-distance travel not just bearable, but actually agreeable. The ideal palfrey was of a lighter, more refined build than the destrier, often showing the influence of Oriental blood from Arabian or Barb horses that may have entered European bloodlines through Spain or the Crusades. They were selected for their gentle, dependable dispositions and their ability to maintain a steady, ground-covering amble for mile after mile. A well-bred palfrey was a status symbol of a different kind, reflecting not martial power but refined taste and the wealth to travel in comfort. And for the backbone of the economy, there was the great horse, or cart horse, the ancestor of today's draft breeds like the Shire and the Percheron. These animals were bred for a single attribute, pure brute-pulling power. Their breeding favored immense size, heavy bone, and a calm, phlegmatic temperament that would not panic in the crowded, noisy environment of a town market or while hitched to a heavy plow. They were the engines of agriculture and commerce, the animals that hauled the harvest from the fields, pulled the stone blocks for cathedrals, and dragged the supply wagons for armies. The breeding of these animals was often managed by monastic communities, who had the stability, land, and long-term outlook necessary to improve bloodlines over decades. Each of these types, the destrier, the palfrey, and the great horse, was the product of a clear-eyed understanding of need and a patient, generations-long commitment to fulfilling it through the deliberate shaping of life itself. This was an investment not in a single horse, but in a future where the needs of war, travel, and work would be met by living machines, perfectly adapted to the world they helped build. Yet for all the physical conditioning, the specialized diet, and the meticulous medical care, the medieval warhorse presented a final, and perhaps most critical, challenge: its mind. 1,000 pounds of muscle and bone was useless on a battlefield if it was governed by panic or stubbornness. The process of transforming a powerful, often willful young horse into a disciplined partner capable of ignoring the deafening roar of combat was not a matter of breaking its spirit, but of carefully building its understanding and trust. The modern term, horse breaking, conjures images of a brutal struggle for dominance, but the medieval approach, particularly for the prized destrier, was often far more nuanced. The ideal was not a cowed and frightened animal, but a confident, responsive extension of the knight's own will. This training began not with a saddle, but with simple, patient familiarity. A young horse destined for the knight's service would first be accustomed to the presence and touch of humans, learning that the groom's hands brought comfort and food, not harm. This foundational trust was the bedrock upon which everything else was built. From there, the animal would be introduced to the sensations and sounds of its future life. A common first step was to accustom the horse to the feel of a simple rope halter, then to the weight and rustle of a cloth draped over its back, mimicking the future weight of a saddle blanket. Gently rattling metal pots or clanging shields at a distance taught it to tolerate the frightening noises of the camp and the battlefield without bolting. This systematic desensitization was a slow, deliberate process, always stopping before the horse became truly terrified, always ending on a calm, positive note. The trainer's goal was to build a library of neutral or even positive associations with objects and sounds that would otherwise trigger its flight instinct. This early, gentle handling produced a horse that was not numb to its surroundings, but rather thoughtfully engaged with them, looking to its human handler for cues on how to react. This foundation of trust was then systematically built upon using sophisticated training techniques that are still central to classical horsemanship today. One of the most important was long reining, a method where the trainer, standing behind and to the side of the horse, uses two long reins attached to a bridle or a caveson, a special noseband designed for training. This allowed the trainer to guide the horse's movement with precise pressure on the reins, teaching it to turn, stop, and move forward in response to subtle signals, all without the weight and distraction of a rider on its back. The horse learned the basic language of aids, the pressure and release that communicates the rider's intent, in a context where the trainer could clearly see its reactions and respond accordingly. This was the equine equivalent of learning to drive in an empty parking lot before navigating city traffic. From here, the horse would graduate to being lunged, worked in a circle on a long line. This was not just about tiring the animal out. It was a critical tool for developing balance, rhythm, and obedience to the voice. The trainer, standing in the center of the circle, would use voice commands, a specific click of the tongue to ask for a trot, a soothing word to walk, a firm whoa to halt, while using a long whip not to strike the horse, but as an extension of his arm to gently direct its energy and define the boundary of the circle. The horse learned to carry itself in a balanced, rhythmic gait, listening intently for the commands from the center. This development of self-carriage and responsiveness to the human voice was absolutely vital. In the heat of a melee, when a knight's hands might be busy wielding a weapon or holding a shield, his voice might be the only cue he could give his horse to pivot, charge, or retreat. A destrier that understood and obeyed the tone and specific sounds of its rider's voice was a truly intelligent weapon system. Only once this comprehensive ground education was complete would the process of introducing a rider begin, and even then, it was done with immense care. The first rider was often not the knight himself, but a skilled and lightweight groom. The initial saddling was a ritual of gradual introduction, allowing the horse to sniff and inspect the strange object before it was gently placed on its back and the girth was tightened, one hole at a time. The first time a rider swung a leg over its back, the horse was held securely by an assistant, reassured by a calm voice and a steady hand. The first steps with a rider were taken in the safe, enclosed space of the yard, with the trainer still on the ground, guiding the horse with a lunge line and reinforcing the voice commands. This patient, step-by-step process ensured that the horse never felt overwhelmed or betrayed, preserving the precious trust that had been so carefully cultivated. The final and most critical stage of training was the conditioning of the warhorse for its ultimate purpose. This went far beyond simple riding. The horse had to become utterly indifferent to the sights, sounds, and smells of violence. Training yards would simulate the chaos of battle. Knights would ride equines, rotating posts with a shield on one arm and a weight on the other, teaching their horses to approach and turn sharply. Squires would run alongside, waving flags and clattering swords against shields. The horse would be trained to stand perfectly still while its rider mounted in full armor, to remain calm amidst the flapping of banners, and most importantly, to respond to the pressure of the rider's legs and weight, allowing the knight to guide it with his seat alone, leaving his hands free for combat. This created an almost telepathic bond. The knight, encased in steel and unable to see or hear clearly, relied on the horse's training and courage as much as his own. The horse, in turn, learned to interpret the slightest shift of its rider's weight, a tightening of a thigh as a command to sidestep, to spin, or to surge forward. This was the ultimate goal of medieval equine training, not a master and a slave, but a fusion of two beings into a single, formidable entity, a partnership of trust and mutual reliance that was forged not through fear, but through patience, understanding, and a shared language of subtle, unspoken cues. Yet all the carefully calibrated systems of the stable were left behind the moment a horse and rider passed through the castle gate, embarking on the open road. Whether on a peaceful pilgrimage to a distant shrine or a grim military campaign into enemy territory, the traveling horse faced a completely different set of challenges, transforming the science of equine care into a daily test of pure resourcefulness. The first and most constant battle was against the relentless wear and tear on the horse's very foundation, its hooves. A journey of hundreds of miles on medieval roads, which were often little more than stony tracks or muddy quagmires, could destroy an unprotected hoof in a matter of weeks. This made the farrier's work before departure absolutely critical. For a long journey, the horse would be shod with a specific type of travel shoe. These were typically lighter than the heavy, calcined shoes of the warhorse, designed for endurance rather than explosive traction. The metal was shaped to provide a full, protective cover for the hoof wall, with a smooth surface to prevent catching on roots or rocks, yet durable enough to withstand week after week of abrasive contact. A key piece of equipment carried by any well-prepared traveling party was a spare set of shoes and the necessary nails. It was expected that a horse would cast a shoe, or simply wear one out, during a long trek. The presence of a skilled person, whether a dedicated farrier accompanying a military column or a groom who had learned basic blacksmithing, could mean the difference between a minor delay and a catastrophic, journey-ending lameness. Finding a suitable place to reshoe a horse on the road was itself an art. They needed a flat, stable piece of ground, often near a stream for both water and to cool the hot metal, and a tree stout enough to tether the horse securely for the noisy, unfamiliar process. This portable anvil and forge, carried on a pack horse, was as vital to the campaign as sacks of grain, a mobile maintenance unit keeping the army's feet, quite literally, in fighting trim. Securing adequate food and water on the move was an even more complex logistical puzzle. The daily rhythm of the journey was dictated by the search for grazing and a clean water source. While armies and large pilgrim groups might have supply wagons carrying hay and oats for the most valuable animals, this store was a precious reserve. For the vast majority of horses on the road, evenings and rest days were dedicated to the essential ritual of picketing. This involved using a long, strong rope or a chain, called a picket line, staked securely into the ground. Horses would be tethered along this line at intervals, giving them enough freedom to move and graze on the surrounding grass without wandering off or becoming entangled with each other. The choice of a campsite was therefore strategic. A marshy area near a river might offer lush grass and plentiful water, but it also came with a higher risk of hoof diseases like thrush and swarms of biting insects. A dry, open hillside offered better drainage and fewer pests, but the grazing was often thinner and water might be farther away. The groom's expertise was judged by his ability to read the land, finding that perfect balance between nourishment and safety for his charges. Watering was a labor-intensive process. While a horse could be led to a stream or pond to drink, the quality of stagnant water was a known hazard. Fast-moving streams were always preferred. For larger groups, or in areas where the water's edge was too steep or muddy, water had to be hauled. Grooms would fill leather buckets or large animal skin bags and carry them back to the picket line, a back-breaking task repeated dozens of times a day. The risk of colic from a hot, tired horse drinking too much too quickly was even greater on the road, so the watering was carefully managed, with animals being walked to cool down before being allowed to drink their fill. The diet itself was a far cry from the regulated rations of the home stable. The quality of the grazing varied wildly, and a horse used to rich meadow grass might find itself trying to subsist on tough, sparse heathland scrub. This was where the groom's knowledge of plants became another layer of defense. He needed to recognize and avoid pastures filled with toxic weeds like ragwort or buttercups, which could sicken or kill a hungry animal. To supplement the inconsistent grazing, foragers would be sent out to gather branches from trees like ash or elm, whose leaves provided a valuable, if unorthodox, source of roughage. In the most dire circumstances on campaign, when the land had been stripped bare by the passing army, horses might be fed whatever was available, including chopped straw or even the bark from trees, a desperate measure that spoke to the brutal reality of medieval logistics. This constant cycle of movement, makeshift stabling, and unpredictable nutrition took a heavy toll. A horse on a long journey was perpetually at risk. Cuts and abrasions from thorns or rocky ground could easily become infected. A sudden change in water could lead to digestive upset. The constant exposure to new environments and other traveling animals made the spread of contagious diseases a terrifying and ever-present threat. A cough or a runny nose in one horse could swiftly become an epidemic that incapacitated an entire company of knights. Groom's resourcefulness was therefore tested at every turn. He was a dietitian, a podiatrist, a nurse, and a logistician, all rolled into one. His success was measured not in gleaming coats or perfect stables, but in the simple, profound achievement of delivering a sound, healthy, and serviceable horse to the journey's end, a testament to a partnership forged not in comfort, but in shared endurance against the open road. But for every magnificent destrier gleaming in a castle stable and every smooth-gated palfrey carrying a noble, there were thousands of other horses whose lives were defined not by the clash of steel, but by the unending turn of the soil. This was the world of the common plow horse, the true, unheralded engine of the medieval agricultural economy. While the knight's charger was a precision instrument of war, the plow horse was a workhorse in the most literal sense, a living, breathing piece of farm equipment, and its care, while more basic and rooted in sheer practicality, was no less vital. The well-being of this single animal, or more often a team of them, was the thin line between a village that thrived and one that teetered on the brink of starvation. Its life was a cycle of relentless labor, and every aspect of its management was tailored to this harsh reality. The plow horse's housing was a world away from the stone-built, ventilated stables of the aristocracy. For most of the year, it likely lived in a simple, timber-framed structure shared with the family's oxen, or even in a section of the very same longhouse where the peasant family lived, separated only by a partition. This wasn't for sentimental reasons. It was a matter of security and warmth. Having your most valuable asset under your own roof meant you could protect it from thieves and predators, and the body heat generated by the large animals helped warm the human living space during the bitter winter months. The floor was likely packed earth, covered with whatever bedding was most readily available, often straw from the harvest, but sometimes just dried ferns or rushes gathered from the woods. The concept of a dedicated groom was a luxury these households could not afford. The care of the horse fell to the farmer and his family, for whom mucking out the stall was one of many back-breaking chores performed by candlelight before and after a long day in the fields. Its diet was a study in austere efficiency. While the Lord's warhorse gorged on oats, the plow horse's primary fuel was hay, and even that was carefully rationed. During the summer, it would graze on common land or the stubble of harvested fields, but through the long winter, its survival depended entirely on the hay harvested the previous summer. This was a nerve-wracking calculation for the farmer. The size of his haystack directly determined whether his horse would make it to spring. A poor harvest or an early, long winter could force heartbreaking choices, forcing the family to stretch their meager supply by mixing in less nutritious straw or even tree bark to fill the animal's belly. Oats were a rare and precious treat, reserved for the most demanding periods of work, like the spring plowing or the autumn harvest, when the extra burst of energy was a non-negotiable investment in the year's food supply. You would never see a common cart horse fat. A condition of lean, hard muscle was the ideal, a sign of an animal that was worked regularly and fed just enough to maintain its strength without any wasteful excess. The most common medical issues these animals faced were not the complex ailments of the campaign trail, but the brutal, repetitive injuries of daily labor. Chief among these were harness sores. The horse's primary interface with its work was the harness, a network of leather straps and a stiff, wooden collar that transferred its pulling power to the plow or cart. If this collar did not fit perfectly, or if it was left on over a patch of damp, sweaty hair, it would rub. At first, it might just wear the hair away, but with continued friction, it would break the skin, creating an open, painful wound. A simple harness sore, if ignored, could quickly become infected, festering into a deep, weeping ulcer that made it impossible for the horse to wear its collar without agony. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It could bring the entire farm's work to a standstill during the critical planting season. The medieval farmer's solution was as practical as the problem. They possessed a deep, folk knowledge of simple remedies. They might apply a poultice of mashed comfrey leaves, known for their healing properties, or a paste of honey and flour to draw out the infection. Greasing the collar with animal fat or lard was a common preventative measure to reduce friction. More importantly, they understood the value of rest and prevention. A conscientious farmer would regularly check his horse's shoulders for hot spots, wash away the caked sweat and dirt after a day's work, and pad the collar with a soft cloth if a sore began to form. This was not care driven by sentimentality, but by a stark economic imperative. This horse was not a pet. It was the family's tractor, their truck, and their primary source of motive power all rolled into one. Its strength tilled the fields that grew their bread, hauled the timber that built their home, and carried their goods to market. A lame or sick plow horse did not just mean veterinary bills. It meant the literal paralysis of the household economy and the very real specter of hunger. The care they provided, therefore, was a profound and silent contract, a promise of sustenance and shelter in exchange for the brute force that kept the wheels of daily life turning. In the end, the true measure of medieval society was not written in the pedigrees of its war horses, but in the calloused hands of the farmer who knew every contour of his plow horse's back, and in the simple, vital act of ensuring it was fit to work another day. While the destrier was a thundering embodiment of raw power on the battlefield, and the plow horse a monument to rustic endurance, there existed another class of equine whose entire purpose was the art of elegant travel. This was the world of the palfrey, a horse bred not for the shock of combat or the pull of the plow, but for the supreme comfort of its rider over long, often tedious, journeys. For the medieval noblewoman, the palfrey was far more than mere transport. It was a mobile throne, a statement of refinement, and a crucial extension of her social identity. The care lavished upon these animals was therefore of a different character entirely, reflecting a world where appearance, comfort, and the subtle signaling of status were paramount. A lady's palfrey was the equivalent of a modern luxury vehicle, and its maintenance was an exercise in prestige. Every aspect of its grooming, from the texture of its coat to the intricate braiding of its mane, was a public performance of wealth and good breeding. The grooming ritual for a high-ranking lady's palfrey was a prolonged and almost ceremonial affair, conducted with a level of fastidiousness that went far beyond simple hygiene. While the war horse was groomed for health and the plow horse for basic function, the palfrey was groomed for visual and tactile perfection. The process would begin with the same fundamental tools: the currycomb, the dandy brush, and the soft body brush, but the execution was different. The groom's touch was lighter, more deliberate, aimed at achieving a coat that didn't just look clean, but possessed a deep, glassy shine that caught the light. This mirror-like finish was achieved not just by brushing, but by a technique known as setting the coat. After the initial cleaning, the groom would use a slightly dampened linen cloth or a wisp, a pad of twisted hay or straw, to rub the coat in a circular motion. This final polishing step laid the hair flat and stimulated the skin's natural oils, creating that coveted, sleek appearance that was the hallmark of a well-kept animal. The mane and tail received particularly ornate attention. They were not merely detangled, they were often washed with mild, herbal infusions of chamomile or rosemary to impart a sweet scent and a soft, silky texture. For special occasions, the mane might be intricately braided with ribbons of silk or fine linen in colors that matched the rider's own attire or her family's heraldry. These braids were more than just decoration. They were a clear, non-verbal announcement of the lady's station and the wealth of her household, demonstrating that she commanded the labor and skill necessary for such frivolous, yet beautiful embellishment. Even the hooves were part of this aesthetic presentation. After being picked clean, they might be rubbed with a dab of lard or neat's foot oil, giving them a dark, healthy gleam that contrasted beautifully with the clean, well-brushed leg feathers often found on these types of horses. This meticulous presentation served a dual purpose. For the lady, it was a matter of personal pride and social standing. Arriving at a tournament, a religious procession, or another noble's castle atop a gleaming, perfectly turned out palfrey immediately communicated her taste, her resources, and the efficiency of her household. For the horse itself, this intensive grooming provided an unparalleled level of comfort. A perfectly clean coat, free of any dirt or chaff, ensured that the saddle and girth would not rub and create sores during long days of travel. A well-braided mane kept the hair from becoming tangled in the reins or the rider's hands. This was care designed to ensure that the horse not only looked the part of an elite companion, but felt comfortable and relaxed enough to perform its primary duty, providing a supremely smooth and steady ride for its esteemed rider. This obsession with comfort and presentation extended seamlessly to the palfrey's tack, which was a world away from the functional, reinforced leather of the warhorse. The saddle used by a noblewoman, particularly the archetypal side saddle, was a masterpiece of ergonomic design tailored to a rider who sat with both legs on one side of the horse. This unique position presented a significant challenge: how to stay securely on the horse without the use of the right leg for grip. The solution was a saddle with a high, fortified pommel at the front and a second, often even higher, pommel, known as a leaping horn, on the side. The rider would hook her right leg around this leaping horn, which provided the necessary security to remain seated even at a canter or if the horse shied. The construction of these saddles was incredibly detailed. The tree, the internal frame, was meticulously carved from beech or oak to fit both the horse's back and the rider's posture perfectly. It was then padded with layers of wool or horsehair and covered in the finest, softest leather, which was often dyed in rich colors and embossed with intricate patterns. The girth, which held the saddle in place, was frequently made of woven silk or fine, supple leather to prevent any chafing on the horse's sensitive underside. The bridle was another focal point for ornate display. While a war horse's bit needed to be strong and simple for maximum control, a palfrey's bit was often made of finely worked metal, sometimes inlaid with copper or even silver for those who could afford it. The reins and the bridle itself were crafted from the softest, most pliable leather, often tooled with decorative patterns and stitched with colored thread. The buckles were polished to a high shine, and the brow band might be embellished with small, enameled plaques bearing the family's coat of arms. This level of ornamentation was not mere vanity, it was a form of social armor. In a society where visual cues were everything, the quality and decoration of a horse's tack were an immediate and unambiguous indicator of its owner's place in the feudal hierarchy. A merchant's wife might own a serviceable palfrey, but its saddle would never boast the silver inlaid trappings or the custom-fitted comfort of a countess's saddle. This created a visible material culture of equine equipment that everyone, from the lowest groom to the highest lord, could read and understand at a glance. The care and maintenance of this tack were, consequently, a sacred duty for the lady's personal groom. The delicate, dyed leather required special attention. It couldn't be scrubbed with harsh sand like a military bridle. Instead, it was cleaned with gentle saddle soap and conditioned with specific oils that would preserve its suppleness without darkening or damaging the decorative tooling. The metal fittings were polished after every single use to maintain their luster and prevent the tarnish that would signal neglect. This was a daily ritual of preservation, ensuring that the tools of elite travel were always in a state of impeccable readiness, reflecting well on the lady and her entire household at all times. Ultimately, the care of the palfrey was a deeply personal affair, often managed by a dedicated servant who answered directly to the lady of the manor herself. Unlike the Marshalsea, who oversaw the entire stable as a military asset, the palfrey's groom was a specialist in the arts of comfort and presentation. This groom's responsibilities were intimately tied to the lady's daily life and social calendar. He needed to know her preferences, how she liked her horse's mane braided, the exact tension she preferred on the girth, the specific pace at which she enjoyed traveling. His work was conducted with a quiet discretion, ensuring that the lady's mount was always perfectly prepared for a leisurely ride through the castle grounds, a journey to a nearby abbey, or a lengthy pilgrimage. The bond between a noblewoman and her palfrey could be profound. Confined by the rigid structures of medieval society, a woman of high birth often had limited freedom of movement and expression. Her horse provided a unique form of agency and liberty. On horseback, she could travel, exercise, and participate in the social life of the court. The palfrey was thus a trusted companion, a confidant during solitary rides, and a symbol of her personal mobility within a world that sought to carefully circumscribe her movements. This relationship elevated the palfrey from a simple beast of burden to a cherished partner, deserving of the most meticulous and thoughtful care. The resources devoted to its well-being, the quality of its feed, the artistry of its tack, the time spent on its grooming were a direct reflection of this esteemed position. In the end, the gleaming coat of the palfrey and its ornate saddle were not just displays of wealth. They were the external manifestations of a sophisticated system of care designed for a singular purpose: to facilitate the graceful, comfortable, and dignified travel of the medieval elite, turning every journey into a statement of refinement and every arrival into a performance of status. But to truly grasp the intellectual foundations of this sophisticated world of equine care, we must journey beyond the stable and the forge, into the quiet scriptoriums of monasteries and the bustling centers of translation in the medieval Islamic world. The remarkable practical knowledge of the Marshalsea did not emerge from a vacuum. It was built upon a bedrock of classical learning that was carefully preserved, translated, and debated across continents and centuries. The single most influential figure in this long chain of knowledge was a Greek military leader and philosopher from the 4th century before the Common Era, Xenophon. His treatise, On Horsemanship, is a work of startling modernity, a detailed manual that moves from selecting a young horse to advanced training techniques. Xenophon championed a philosophy based on kindness and understanding, arguing that a horse's obedience must be won through reward and gentle correction, not through force and fear. He provided intricate advice on everything from the proper way to mount, so as not to startle the animal, to exercises for making the horse nimble and responsive. This wasn't just theory, it was a system born from a lifetime of experience, and its principles would echo through the stables of medieval Europe over 1,000 years later. The survival of this precious text, however, was anything but guaranteed. As the Roman Empire in the West fragmented, the vast libraries of Greek and Roman knowledge were scattered, their papyrus scrolls crumbling in the damp European climate. The great works of authors like Xenophon and the later Roman veterinarian Vegetius risked being lost forever to the Latin-speaking West. It was during this period of fragility that the torch of classical learning was seized and brilliantly carried forward by Arab scholars. In the vibrant intellectual capitals of the Islamic world, such as Baghdad and Cordoba, a massive, state-sponsored project of translation was underway. Caliphs and wealthy patrons funded the work of scholars who meticulously translated hundreds of Greek manuscripts into Arabic, preserving and expanding upon this ancient wisdom. Within this rich scholarly environment, the science of horsemanship, or Farriers, flourished. Arab writers didn't just passively copy Xenophon. They absorbed his ideas, tested them, and integrated them with their own deep, practical knowledge of the Arabian horse, an animal revered in their culture. They produced their own extensive manuals, adding new insights on veterinary medicine, breeding, and the specialized care required for horses in arid environments. These Arabic texts became new, enriched repositories of equine science, now blending Greek theory with Eastern practical innovation. The next great transfer of this knowledge back into Europe began in the 11th and 12th centuries, often through the cultural crossroads of Spain and Sicily, where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars lived in close proximity. In cities like Toledo, after it was reconquered by Christian forces, teams of translators worked tirelessly, often in a fascinating collaborative process. A Jewish scholar might translate the Arabic text aloud into the local Romance language, while a Christian monk would then write it down in formal Latin. Through this intricate multi-step process, the wisdom of Xenophon, now filtered and enhanced through centuries of Arabic scholarship, finally returned to a Europe that was hungry for it. The primary engines for the dissemination of these newly recovered texts were the monasteries. In their scriptoriums, monks with skilled hands spent countless hours painstakingly copying these Latin translations onto durable parchment, creating the husbandry manuals that would become the most valuable possessions of the great aristocratic stables. These were not books for the masses. They were expensive, functional tools, often beautifully illuminated, containing a mix of direct classical quotation, Arabic editions, and local folk remedies gathered over generations. A marshal consulting his Book of Marshalsea was therefore accessing a truly globalized body of knowledge. On a single page, he might find Xenophon's advice on training, an Arabic recipe for a strengthening tonic made with dates and spices, and a local charm to protect a horse from witchcraft. This created a dynamic and living tradition. The classical texts provided the authoritative framework, the tried and tested principles of anatomy, training, and hygiene. But medieval marshals were not slavish followers of ancient books. They were pragmatists. They used this classical foundation as a starting point, a set of hypotheses to be tested against the harsh reality of their own environment. The European warhorse was a different beast from the lighter horses Xenophon knew, and the cold, damp climate presented ailments unknown in the Mediterranean world. So they adapted. They took the core principles and applied them to their own challenges, adding their own hard-won discoveries to the margins of the manuscripts. This constant dialogue between inherited text and practical experience is the true legacy of classical knowledge in the medieval stable. It wasn't a dead tradition, but a living one, a conversation across time and space that ensured the care of the horse remained a sophisticated and ever-evolving art, connecting the marshals of medieval England to the battlefields of ancient Greece through the fragile, enduring power of the written word. But behind every gleaming destrier and every smoothly functioning stable, there was an army of dedicated, often invisible, individuals whose hands performed the work that kept the entire system running. This was the world of the grooms, the stable boys, and the farriers, the unsung heroes whose daily labor formed the bedrock of medieval equine care. While knights and lords took the credit for victories and received the glory, it was these men and boys whose skill and diligence ensured that the knight had a healthy, capable horse to ride in the first place. Theirs was a life of relentless, physically demanding work, conducted in the dim light of the stable and the acrid smoke of the forge, a world of mud, manure, and muscle where the line between a thriving animal and a dead one was drawn by their calloused hands. The journey for a young boy entering this world typically began as a stable lad, sometimes as young as 7 or 8 years old, hailing from the peasant class or coming from a family already embedded in the Lord's service. His initial duties were the most basic and unglamorous. He was the perpetual motion machine of the stable, tasked with the Sisyphean chore of mucking out stalls. This meant using a wooden shovel and a wheelbarrow to remove soiled bedding and manure, a job that had to be done thoroughly and repeatedly throughout the day to maintain the stable's crucial hygiene. He would be the one hauling heavy buckets of water from the well, sweeping the aisles, and ensuring that the endless supply of hay and straw was stacked neatly in the loft. This was not just child labor, it was a form of apprenticeship by immersion. From his first day, he was learning the fundamental rhythms of the stable, the sounds and smells of health and sickness, and the immense, non-negotiable importance of cleanliness. The senior grooms and the marshalsea would watch him closely, judging his temperament. Was he patient? Was he gentle with the animals, or was he rough and fearful? Did he pay attention to the smallest details, like a loose nail in a stall or a slight change in a horse's appetite? A boy who showed promise, a natural affinity for the work, and a resilient spirit would gradually be entrusted with more responsibility. Under the watchful eye of an experienced groom, he would learn the intricate art of grooming itself. He was taught not just how to use the currycomb and brushes, but why he was using them. He learned that the circular motion of the currycomb wasn't just about cleaning, but about stimulating circulation, and that the final polish with the soft brush was what sealed the coat against the rain. He was taught how to pick out a hoof safely, how to recognize the smell of thrush, and how to carefully braid a mane or tail without pulling or breaking the hair. This knowledge was passed down not from a book, but from hand to hand, from demonstration to practice, in a continuous chain of practical wisdom. The social hierarchy within the stable was as rigidly defined as the feudal society it served. At the very bottom were the stable lads, the raw recruits. Above them were the common grooms, the skilled tradesmen of the equine world. A groom was responsible for the direct, hands-on care of a specific set of horses, perhaps 4 or 5 animals. He was the one they saw morning and night. He knew their individual quirks, their preferred scratches, their subtle moods. His was a role of profound intimacy and trust. A good groom could detect a slight lameness simply by the way a horse shifted its weight as he entered the stall, or sense a brewing fever by the feel of the skin behind its ears. He was the first line of defense, the one who raised the alarm at the first sign of trouble. His diligence was the difference between a minor issue caught early and a catastrophic illness that could sweep through the stable. Above the grooms stood the head groom or the chief marshal in a great household. This individual was a manager, a diagnostician, and a leader. He allocated duties, managed the fodder and supply budgets, and possessed the final say on all matters of daily care. He was the direct link to the lord or the knight, reporting on the condition of the horses and advising on training, purchases, and breeding. His position commanded respect, and a head groom with a reputation for running a healthy, efficient stable was a highly sought-after professional, his services a valuable commodity among the nobility. Then there was the farrier, who occupied a unique and respected niche. He was not quite a groom, nor was he merely a blacksmith. His forge was a separate domain, a place of fire, steel, and specialized knowledge. He was a crucial partner to the marshalsea, for the health of the hoof was inextricably linked to the health of the entire horse. His training was a long and demanding apprenticeship, learning not only the art of blacksmithing, how to heat, hammer, and shape iron, but also the complex anatomy of the equine foot. A mistake with his hammer or a misjudged angle on a shoe could lame a priceless animal as surely as a sword stroke. The responsibility resting on these shoulders was immense, and the consequences of failure were severe. A groom who neglected to properly cool down a hot horse, allowing it to drink too much cold water and founder, could single-handedly destroy a knight's primary mount and his own career in one afternoon. A farrier who drove a nail too deep into the sensitive laminae of the hoof, causing a painful abscess and infection, could be held financially liable for the cost of the animal and its lost service. There are records of legal disputes where grooms and marshals were sued for negligence, their professional judgment called into question. Yet, for all this pressure, theirs was a life of little glory and modest reward. While a master farrier with his own forge could achieve a level of comfortable independence, the common groom lived a life of humble service. His wages were meager, his quarters were usually a small room attached to the stable itself, and his work was never done, continuing through weekends, holidays, and deep into the night when a horse was sick or a mare was foaling. He worked in all weather, his hands permanently stained and calloused, his clothes carrying the distinct, earthy scent of the stable. But within this world, there was a deep and abiding sense of pride and camaraderie. They were the guardians of the most important assets in their society, and they knew it. The sight of a team of well-matched destriers, their coats shining, their movements powerful and coordinated, was a testament to their skill. The trust a skittish young horse placed in a gentle groom, or the way a war horse would lower its head in contentment for its favorite caretaker, were the unspoken rewards of their profession. They formed a community bound by shared knowledge, shared labor, and a shared, unspoken understanding that while the knight might win the battles, it was their quiet, relentless dedication that made those victories possible in the first place. So how do we piece together this intricate picture of medieval horse care, separating historical fact from romantic fiction? The evidence doesn't come from a single source, but from a fascinating partnership between two distinct fields: the hard, physical science of archaeology and the rich, interpretive world of art history. Together, they act as a powerful time machine, allowing us to cross the centuries and observe these practices with our own eyes. From the ground, archaeologists unearth the silent, tangible remnants of daily life. Imagine an excavator's trowel, carefully scraping away centuries of soil to reveal the dark, unmistakable outline of a decomposed wooden post. This simple stain in the earth is a ghost of a stable wall, and by mapping a network of these post holes, we can reconstruct the entire building's dimensions, understanding how much space was allotted to each animal and how the structure was organized for ventilation and drainage. Sometimes, the soil itself holds chemical secrets. Advanced analysis of soil samples taken from the floors of these long-vanished stables can reveal elevated levels of phosphates and nitrates, the chemical fingerprints of concentrated animal waste. This allows us to identify exactly where the stable stood and even estimate how many horses were housed there, based on the intensity of the residue. But the most dramatic archaeological finds are the objects themselves, particularly those made of durable metal. The discovery of a medieval horseshoe, often identified by its characteristic wavy outer edge and the distinct pattern of its nail holes, is a thrilling event. By studying its size, weight, and shape, we can begin to guess its purpose. Was this a heavy, thick shoe for a destrier, or a lighter, smoother one for a palfrey? Even more common than whole shoes are the horseshoe nails, scattered like tiny metal breadcrumbs across medieval sites. Their presence in a layer of soil securely dated to the 10th century, for example, is concrete proof that horses were being shod in that location at that time, helping us to pinpoint the technology's widespread adoption. Bits and bridle fittings offer another intimate window into the horse's experience. A simple, jointed snaffle bit made of iron suggests a different training philosophy and level of control compared to a more severe curb bit with its long shanks. The wear patterns on these metal pieces, polished smooth by the horse's tongue and bars, speak to thousands of hours of use, telling a silent story of a long partnership between rider and steed. Perhaps the most poignant evidence, however, comes from the horses themselves. The The skeletal remains of medieval horses, unearthed from castle moats, town ditches, and even honored burials beside their owners, are like biological archives. By analyzing the chemical isotopes locked within the bones and teeth, scientists can determine what the animal ate throughout its life. A war horse's bones might show a signature of a consistent, high-quality grain diet, while a common cart horse's remains might tell a story of seasonal variation, with periods of plenty and periods of near starvation. The bones also record a lifetime of physical stress. We find vertebrae fused together from the constant strain of carrying a heavy rider, arthritic changes in joints from years of hard work, and telltale ridges on the teeth from the abrasion of a bit. These skeletons provide undeniable, physical proof of the immense demands placed on the medieval horse and the physical price it paid for its service. While archaeology gives us the bones of the operation, it is medieval art that puts the flesh on them, transforming silent artifacts into a living, breathing world. Illuminated manuscripts, tapestries, and wall paintings burst with color and detail, offering a visual encyclopedia of daily life that written records alone cannot provide. We see the stable not as a collection of post holes, but as a bustling center of activity in the background of a noble scene. In the lush miniatures of books of hours, we can observe the architecture of a stable, the high, vaulted ceilings designed for ventilation, the sturdy wooden stalls, and the haylofts packed with fodder. These images confirm the architectural principles we unearth, showing us how the space was actually used. Tapestries, like the famous series of The Lady and the Unicorn, often depict horses being groomed with exquisite care. We can see the groom's tools in his hands, the curved curry comb, the different brushes, and observe the very postures and techniques he uses. This isn't an artist's guess, it's a direct snapshot of a skilled professional at work, validating the descriptions we find in textual manuals. The care and accuracy with which artists depicted horse tack is particularly revealing. In countless depictions of knights and nobles, the saddles, bridles, and girths are rendered with meticulous precision. We can see the intricate buckles, the specific types of bits, and the way the straps were arranged. This visual evidence is invaluable for reconstructing how this equipment functioned and how it was fitted to the horse. It shows us, for instance, the difference between the deep, secure war saddle with its high cantle and the lighter, more comfortable saddle of a traveling noblewoman. Art also captures the spirit of the relationship between human and horse in a way that bones and metal cannot. The famous Bayeux tapestry, while telling the story of the Norman conquest of England, is also a sprawling documentary on 11th century horse culture. It shows horses being loaded onto ships, being fed and watered, and most dramatically, charging into battle. We see them not as generic animals, but as individuals, some charging forward with ears pricked in excitement, others shying away from the chaos. These depictions remind us that behind every artifact, every set of bones, there was a living, feeling creature with its own personality and its own role to play in the grand tapestry of history. Yet, we must also be cautious art historians. Medieval art was not always created to be a photorealistic record. It was often symbolic, idealized, or designed to flatter a patron. A king might be depicted on a perfect, idealized destrier far larger than any real horse could be, as a symbol of his power rather than a reflection of reality. The artist might omit the mud, the flies, and the less glamorous aspects of stable life to present a more polished, harmonious vision. Therefore, the true power of this investigation lies in the convergence of evidence. When the skeletal remains of a horse show the spinal damage consistent with carrying great weight, and we simultaneously find a heavy, fortified war saddle depicted in a manuscript from the same period, the picture comes into sharp, undeniable focus. The archaeological find provides the hard proof, and the artistic depiction provides the context and the human element, allowing us to bridge the gap of centuries and truly understand the depth and sophistication of the bond and the care that define the medieval world's relationship with the horse. And so we reach the end of our journey through the stables and forges of the medieval world. a journey that reveals a truth far richer than simple brute force. The care of the horse was not a matter of random guesswork, but a highly developed, intricate system, a sophisticated fusion of sharp-eyed observation, deeply ingrained tradition, and the first sparks of a methodical, scientific approach. We have seen how the medieval stable was not a dark shed, but a carefully engineered environment designed for health, with its deep litter systems providing warmth and its high ceilings ensuring clean air. We have uncovered the high-stakes logistics of the hay harvest, a race against time that determined survival, and the complex dietary science that powered the warhorse without causing its collapse. From the farrier's forge, where anatomy met metalwork in the art of the horseshoe, to the Marshalsea's satchel, where herbal poultices and painful blistering treatments existed side by side, we have witnessed a world of profound contradiction and ingenuity. This entire edifice of knowledge, passed from master to apprentice and enriched by texts preserved across cultures, was not a luxury. It was the absolute, non-negotiable foundation upon which medieval society was built. The knight's power, the merchant's wealth, the farmer's harvest, and the pilgrim's progress, all of it moved on four hooves. The health of the horse was synonymous with the health of the kingdom, a living, breathing infrastructure that demanded and received a level of care we are only now beginning to fully appreciate. It was a partnership forged in the mud of the plowed field and the chaos of the battlefield, a testament to a bond that shaped our history in ways we are still uncovering. As we look back from our world of modern veterinary medicine and manufactured feeds, it leaves us with one final, compelling question to ponder. With all our advanced technology, which of these ancient, observation-based techniques do you believe would still hold its own today? Could the principles of the deep litter system be adapted for animal welfare? Or does the Marshalsea's herbal wisdom contain remedies that our science has overlooked? We would love to hear your thoughts on which of these forgotten arts still has a place in our world. Share your ideas in the comments below.